On the heels of last semester's course on horror films, scholars Stanford, Carpenter, and Eric Wesselmann are back with a new honors seminar and set of public screenings at the Normal Theater. The series features 4 Blaxploitation films and a documentary about the era, and it kicks off this week with Melvin Van Peebles' Sweetback's Baadasssss song. The seminal 1971 independent film kicked off nearly a decade of prolific filmmaking for black actors, directors, and producers. But as Carpenter tells WGLT's Lauren Warnicki, naming a course on blaxploitation films turned out to be tricky.
Looking at it through today's sensibility, my first thought was, wow, if somebody maybe didn't know what blaxploitation films were, if this was a new term to them, how would they respond to it? And my first thought was, it didn't sound good, to somebody who'd never heard it before. Whereas if you've heard it before, it's like, oh, this is cool. This is a touchstone for a moment of time, But if you're coming to it not being familiar with the world, which is the case with most students, I could see where a lot of questions would come up, and Eric and I actually had a lot of conversations about that. One of the things that I arrived at very quickly was we couldn't have blaxploitation at the front of the title. In fact, we took, the phrase "Can you dig it?" which is something we wanted to incorporate into the title, and initially we were talking about having it at the end. We actually moved it to the front, and then used the title to kind of explain where we were going with the term before we got to the term. So that's why you get the title, "Can you dig it?" Exploring race and representation in blaxploitation films.
Can you dig it? Who's the cat that walk about when there's danger all about? Right on. They say this cat Shaft is a bad mother. I'm talking about Shaft.
In my lifetime, I've experienced my identity being referred to as Negro, Black, Afro-American, African-American, right? So in some ways, it's kind of fitting that you would have trouble with the term for the 70s, because back then, even how we referred to African-American identity was different, right? And some of the terms for African-American identity have not weathered well. I kind of think it's par for the course, and it's part of the work that we have to do when we're introducing these things to new people.
Eric, can you talk about the capacity for students in their 20s to take on that historical context and really wrestle with it?
I found that most students, even if they are a little shocked, as long as they're given some sort of heads up, they appreciate the opportunity to wrestle with these things. That's part of why people are in college. Most people's reaction to this term, and this is true even among scholars and critics who were writing at the time, very much responded to that word exploitation, because it's a tricky word, right? We come to it as lay folks, and we think about, okay, people are being exploited. That's bad. But when you look at the history of cinema, that term itself is also tricky, because there were quote unquote exploitation films, which blaxploitation was one type. But also the term exploitation is kind of an action in film. There's a long history of this term exploitation, which really just means, how do you get attention from an audience? How do you identify a group of people that you want to, come to your film? And how do you bring them in? Then there's exploitation films, which say it's all about sensation and not really about message.
I have some apprehension about these films in the way that women specifically are treated and represented. And so Pam Grier notwithstanding. So
but she's 25% of the film series.
It's true.
My name's Carpenter.
Coffee, black and stacked and packed with fury, with both barrels zeroed in on the mob's top killers.
This is the end of your rotten life, you dope pusher.
And I'd say probably about the mid-aughts, you actually had a lot of women of color who were film scholars who were revisiting these films and, sort of acknowledging this ambivalent tension because yes, there are problematic elements, and there was also a lot of strength. As a matter of fact, one book I was just reading yesterday, the scholar, she was arguing that the Blaxploitation heroines, Pam Grier, Tamara Dobson, they sort of set the model for the modern action heroine. Like, they basically argued, if you didn't have Coffee and you didn't have Cleopatra Jones, you wouldn't have had Ripley in Alien.
Literally my first impression when I was young of Blaxploitation films, the women in Blaxploitation films, and an impression that has endured over time for me, regardless of of whether I felt positively or negatively about the overall portrayal, is that women were portrayed as having agency over their, for the most part, they had agency over their body. They also had agency as it related to violence. And I think that's something that's very important to talk about. Whenever we start getting into heroic narratives, what's really important are what characters are actually able to have agency over violence. They are the ones who pick up the gun. They are the ones who decide who gets shot. They're the ones who stand and fight and protect. They're the ones who, many of these are revenge fantasies. They're the ones seeking revenge, because that's like the primary way in which, one of the primary ways in which agency is expressed within these genres. And leaving Blaxploitation films a little bit, I think of one Marvel character that is entirely based on Pam Grier would be Misty Knight. If you look at what happens when you take a Black female character and give her agency, give her power, give her control, like, she actually stands out within the Marvel universe, which to some degree also makes her a critique of women in the MCU. The irony is, to some degree, Pam Grier has been typecast as a Black woman with agency.
One of the criticisms, maybe in hindsight, of the Blaxploitation era is that it presented Black people as criminals, as vigilante justice seekers, as, drug addicted, as over-sexualized, and that white people's voyeurship of that was allowing them to dig in their heels with stereotypes that they were perceiving.
Well, I think there's the inverse to that is something else that was present for a Black audience, right? They were seeing somebody who wasn't passively accepting violence from the police. So yeah, one of the beautiful things about stories is that you can come to the story and you can bring your position and you can see different things in it. And that's also one of the downsides of the story if you're trying to control a message, right? I look at Sweetback's Baadasssss song, and we see a Black man who's on the run. He's on the run from police, but the police are functioning in the same way as the bounty hunters did during slavery. What you could argue, oh my gosh, yes, he's fighting the police. He's killed a police officer, or he's done this, he's done that. But ultimately, if you're keying into that character, you're also realizing that this is his literal journey to freedom.
Can you take it, baby?
Can You Dig It? Exploring race, representation, and culture in Blaxploitation films begins with Sweetback's Baadasssss song. It screens Thursday at the Normal Theater and continuing weekly through February 22nd. Author and filmmaker David Walker will attend the final event of the series. That's a screening of his documentary film, Macked, Hammered, Slaughtered, and Shafted. WGLT's Lauren Warnicki spoke with co-professors Eric Wesselmann and Stanford Carpenter.